Good evening and welcome to the Koppel Project. I'm Baroness Helena Kennedy, I'm the creative director of the Koppel Project and the curator of the current exhibition. This evening we're very honoured to be joined by Helena Kennedy, one of the UK's most distinguished lawyers and thinkers. As part of our Refugee programme, Helena will share some of her insights into the complexities of the current refugee crisis. We will then open the discussion to the artists in the current exhibition, who will also introduce themselves and tell you a small amount about their work. And then we'll be opening the discussion to the floor. After the talk and Q&A, there'll be a short break, and then an opportunity to have some refreshments, and then for those who wish to join us, we'll be doing a curated tour of the exhibition. I wish you all a wonderful evening. Please welcome Helena Kennedy.
Gabby, thank you very much for introducing me, and I give it a strict injunction. I didn't want any lengthy introduction. I was at something not very long ago where I was introduced by a young woman as Helena Kennedy, the lawyer who represents women and other criminals. And lots of you here tonight. So it's very lovely to be here. And I've had the great privilege of already going downstairs and seeing the exhibition, and it really is a wonderful exhibition of fine artists contributing to tonight's event, and you'll see it all yourselves when the time comes. I really feel that art often has a way of exploring some of these issues, but in very powerful messages about what it means to actually be someone who is fleeing terror, who is fleeing for your life, somebody who has faced persecution or war, or the many horror stories that I've sat and heard from people who have been seeking sanctuary in this country. I wanted to start tonight by saying that, this is Refugee Week. This is the United Nations declares a Day of Refugees, and that was yesterday, but the whole of this week has been given over to letting us reflect on what it must mean to be a refugee, and indeed some of our artists are refugees, people who have come and are making a life away from the place that they consider to be home. And I was invited on Monday, yes, I'm trying to keep track of the week, yesterday, because it was Refugee Day, down to King's College to address an audience of people who were really people studying in the field, but also from the Refugee Council and so on. And I started by reminding people just why this issue is one that, again, is engaging us in such a toxic way at the moment over the European referendum debates, but how readily and easily we forget why the Refugee Convention came into being after the Second World War, of the ways in which these people's narratives of horror and of fleeing should still be seared in our brains, but we forget it too readily. And the way that the language very deliberately, if you look at, there was a sort of display of headlines from the Daily Mail, in fact that partly the Daily Express has had every single day for the last 30 days, there's been a migrant headline hostile to immigration on the front page of the Daily Express. But it's virtually been the same in the Daily Mail too. And I had been a couple of months ago to a meeting at the Refugee Council, and there's a game that they play with you at the Refugee Council where they'll say to you, I'm going to read you a headline and tell me when it comes from. And some of the Daily Mail headlines that they will read to you, which you would think were, sounded like today, in fact were used in the 30s when we had Jewish migrants fleeing for their lives, fleeing persecution, and yet the Daily Mail's line was that we didn't need more people coming in, that we were being flooded, that our system was not going to buckle under it, that there wasn't enough resource for this, that they would have to be able to show that they could pay for themselves, other people would have to pay the bill and make sure that they were going to sponsor people who were fleeing, and the same kind of horror being expressed, hostility. I'm afraid we tell it as a good story when we talk about kinder transport and so on, but I'm afraid the very same siren voices that we're hearing today were being heard back then in the 30s, in the lead up to the Second World War. And again, if you look back, and they take you back again to headlines at the time of the pogroms, when people were fleeing at the beginning of the 20th century, coming often from horrible victimization, terrible attempts to destroy whole villages of Jewish people. People fleeing to this country were not being greeted with warmth and enthusiasm. They were not being embraced as people who needed sanctuary. So we mustn't be misled into thinking that we've always been tolerant. It isn't to say that there haven't been, of course, sections of our society that have been tolerant, but we tell our story, as we always do, in the best way for ourselves. And our story in the past has not always been great, and we've always had to make the arguments as to why there have to be protections for people who are fleeing from persecution. And so today, I'm afraid, we're seeing a return of something that history should have taught us does return. And I am anxious about it because I think there is a whiff of fascism in the air. And if we do not deal with it in the right way, I'm afraid, and talk it down and expose it for what it is, and I'm afraid it can very easily take hold, especially when people are going through a time of financial hardship, where they're feeling that they are suffering disadvantage. And we in London often don't realise the ways in which other people in the country are facing difficulties and are facing hardship. And therefore, if they don't, if you tell them that it's been caused by resource being taken up by those who are arriving on our shores, then of course it's very easy to feed that fantasy. And so that's why I think that we need to remind ourselves during Refugee Week what it's all about. I'm a lawyer. I'm essentially a criminal lawyer, actually. But as my practice progressed, as a young lawyer going through the system, I always did civil liberties work. I always was somebody representing people who were involved in sort of politically flavoured sorts of cases, doing cases around racism, doing cases involving gender discrimination and so on. And then ultimately doing very serious stuff around the Irish Troubles, an area of our history that is perhaps closer to home, but where it came out of a whole section of our society in Northern Ireland. The Catholics of Northern Ireland faced real discrimination. They couldn't get jobs, they were kept out of schools, they didn't get public housing, and the discrimination was very real. And so they looked at what had happened in the 60s in the United States and said, well, we want civil liberties too, and we want civil rights. And so it led to, first of all, demonstrations on the streets, and then of course there was a repression to hold it down, and then of course it turns nastier, and then you get the rise of the IRA and extremism, and you end up with really nasty stuff happening in your midst. And so we really have to be alert to the ways in which things can take place if you treat people without justice. And so that's been the kind of work that I've done. And more recently, work that takes my interest and my involvement to wrongs that are happening in other parts of the world, the ways in which the Islamic terrorism is affecting our lives, and how we have to hold on to the principles that underpin our legal system to make sure that there isn't discrimination, even when we're dealing with things that we're horrified by, that we hold on to the principles that actually make living in a civilized and decent society what it's all about. So my work now is often about things around persecution, torture, asylum, and so on. And a lot of my work is now increasingly about how women experience that. Because I used to write about the system and how the system failed particular people. And I started off writing around women as the paradigm for law's failure. Because if law was created with men in mind as the great offenders, then you have to look and say, well, was law prepared in a way to deal with women? And so women often missed out in the legal system, coming before the courts as victims of crime, coming before the courts as women who were accused of crime, but often facing stereotypes, facing myths about women, and the women themselves often feel that they failed something more than transgressing the criminal law, but that maybe that they had somehow failed as women. And so I started writing about all of that, and in doing so, it starts putting a light into the way in which law operates and what law's purpose is, and how you have to keep working at it to make sure that it delivers well for the whole of a society. Now, my work now takes me into, as I've said, into many different fields, but what underpins it all, of course, are the principles of human rights. And the Refugee Convention is one of those things that is absolutely screaming out to us all that this is about human rights, about respecting the other, about being human in the way that we respond to acts of inhumanity. And so when the Refugee Convention came into being after the Second World War, it was looking at the fact that people were stateless, people had to flee, people did not have sanctuary, and often nations were not prepared to offer them the sanctuary, or if they did, not citizenship. And all of our ideas of law were sort of wrapped around notions of citizen, being a citizen in a place. And that was why we started looking at whether there shouldn't be rights attaching to people or nothing to do with citizenship, but they had to do with the fact that you were a human being, that it was based on your humanity and respecting the dignity of the other, whoever they may be, and that you mustn't just attach it to being a citizen somewhere because so many people who are not citizens were being deprived of their rights. And the business about refugees was it created a responsibility on nations to provide that sanctuary when sanctuary was sought. And we shouldn't delude ourselves. The vast majority of refugees do not come all the way to Britain. They actually go to the country that's next door. Most people end up in refugee camps in the nation next door to where they've been. That's why the Syrians just now are all in camps in Jordan and in Lebanon and so on. People on the whole, if you're going to look at the numbers involved, are in places around where they've been. They don't go far from home because they imagine that they're going to go back as soon as it's possible. And that's what they hope and pray for. And it's often the most kind of, if you like, thrusting and entrepreneurial and the most kind of, determined that make the long journeys to somewhere else. Now, one of the things I wanted us to talk about tonight was that we have to be very clear in our minds. When we're talking about refugees, we mustn't muddle all this stuff which is currently being done around migration and immigration, so that people use the language in a way as if it's all the same thing, and it isn't. When people are fleeing war, or fleeing conflict, or fleeing persecution, and therefore become refugees seeking refuge, it's different from people migrating because it's very hard to get by, or they want to make a better life. And many of us, many of you in this room will know people who've come from Romania or Bulgaria or whatever, and they're working in London, or Poles, and it's not because they're here fleeing persecution, they're here because wages back home are so miserable that they know that coming here for a couple of years will somehow make good, and they'll be able to return with enough to set up their small business, enough to kind of buy the house that they're not going to be able to buy, enough to pay for whatever it is that they feel, the education of their children or whatever. And many people do that, and the world has ticked on that sort of thing. The world has got by on that kind of thing for a very long time. People coming, migrant labour, sending money back to where they come from. And so there are all mingled in these arguments just now about migration and immigration, and these people coming here and taking our resources, a sort of fusing of different peoples, people who are European Union people where there's the freedom to travel, the people who are from beyond the European Union, who are saying, can't we make a life in somewhere that's better than the place from which we come? And that description of what is now being determined as being economic migrants, as distinct from people who are refugees fleeing from something really terrible, like you're fleeing for your life or that of your children. So we make sure that we don't muddy the water by pulling all of that in together, because it's allowed to contaminate some of the important things that were put in place in order to protect the most vulnerable. Because refugees are some of the most vulnerable people that you'll ever come across in the world, and they're also often the most vilified, and we have to recognize that. I've sat in detention centres with women who can't even give voice to the things that they've witnessed, seeing their children being slaughtered, being raped over and over and over again. Last week, I, with Lord Alton, David Alton and I in the House of Lords, raised the whole issue. I had received an email the day after it happened from Syria about a group of 19 women who were rounded up by ISIL and put into a cage in the centre of Mosul, and the cage was set on fire and they were burned to death. 19 women, girls actually, some of them still children really, 13 and 14. And it was because they were refusing to be sex slaves to the men who destroyed them in that way. They were heard screaming, and people were rounded up into the square to watch it as a lesson to them of what ISIL were capable of doing. And the Yazidi women belong to a very small and ancient community that has existed in a part of Syria and northern Iraq for a long time. And when I say a long time, I mean we're talking pre-Judeo-Christian religions, pre-Islamic, and we're talking about they're sort of like Zoroastrians, and it's a very, very ancient and very small religious grouping, and the Islamic Daesh are now saying that they are primitives, because they're not even of the Ibrahimic religions. And so that they're not in the business of wanting even to try and persuade them to be converted. These are people who are lesser, which is justifying their destruction of the men, many of the men, a bit like happened in Sarajevo and places. Many of the men have been killed, but the girls and girl children and young women are being used as sex slaves. And the stories are just horrifying. And we in Chambers only a few weeks ago had one of the young women who has been in Germany as a refugee, has been having physical treatment because she was so damaged by the many rapes that she was subjected to. And she testified to what she saw happening. You know, watching a child being put into a tin bin and sitting out in the heat, and the mother not being allowed to go to the child and being held, and all the women screaming, watching this child, screaming and screaming until eventually the child, having been left in the sun, dies of dehydration. I mean, it's just too terrible to give voice to. So we were standing up in the House of Lords saying, this is a genocide that we're seeing taking place. This is genocide. This is about trying to destroy people. Genocide came into being after what happened in the attempts to destroy Jews during Hitler's time. And it had never existed as a legal concept before. And it's saved for that idea of trying to destroy a whole people. And yet there's an unwillingness for us to give that title to what's happening to the Yazidi women. And what we were calling for was for Britain and for the British government, which has a seat at the Security Council table, to be getting this put onto the agenda of the Security Council so that the people who are doing this know that they will never ever escape justice. That for as long as they live, they are at risk of coming before a court and being tried for the worst crime in the annals. And they have to know that. And people who are thinking of going to join them have to know that that's what these people are doing. And naming it is part of the way in which you can show the urgency of our situation. And the reluctance of government is, of course, about the fact that other peoples get worried that they might be accused, the Chinese, of doing similar things to some of their own minorities. There are fears that, for example, the Turks will not accept that what they did to the Armenians amounted to a genocide at the time. So the use of that language, of course, is very difficult, but we're watching something happening and we're not prepared to name it. And we're also not prepared to give space to those Yazidi women. Because earlier on, about 3 months ago, I got up and said I wanted us to be giving some kind of sanctuary to some of these women in order that they might be able to receive psychological help for post-traumatic stress disorder, that they might be able to receive some of the physical help that they need for the damage to their intestines and their uterus. Many of them have tears and so on. And yet they're in refugee camps, many of them. These are not women who are going to want to settle here. They want to go back to be with their families and their parents and their brothers and sisters, if they still exist. And they certainly aren't wanting to go to a place where they don't speak the language and where they know so little. They want to be with their own folk. And so it's about a temporary thing to do the right thing by them, and yet so often we say no. So I just want you to know that, you know, we feel that we live in a great society, and indeed we do, but we still sometimes fail the tests of what it is to be civilized, and particularly in relation to the most vulnerable in our world. And so that's when we come to talk about refugees, that we must make a distinction, and we must keep reminding people that many of the people who are fleeing to us are people in dire need, and they come and they actually, test us as to our humanity and to the decency of our society. But I wanted to talk about one or two of the other things that are going to be presented to us. We've got real challenges in our world. As I watch those boats with young African men mainly, not always, because sometimes it's families, but often young African men coming up from the centre, the centre of Africa, making their way and to get onto those boats. And we watch them and we see the horror of when they sink, and so many of those people drown in the Mediterranean. And yet I know, because of some work that I've been doing recently on human rights and climate change, that we ain't seen nothing yet. Because the reality is that as our world is going to be confronted with more and more problems around climate change, with the seas rising and people losing their livelihood on the edge of the ocean, fishermen and people who are make their lives out of fishing and are having to flee inwards because of the encroachment of the oceans. That people in the middle of Africa who are seeing their land becoming more and more arid and becoming desert and can't scratch an existence on it. They scrape together the meager things, monies that they have, and they give it to their one most precious and most, if you like, vital person amongst them. And their money is given to the son to try and get away and make a life somewhere else. And that's what they will do, is flee in order to survive. And we are going to see more and more and more of it. And unless we try to address some of those world problems, the problem of climate change, and how we as the rich world deal with the poor world in trying to embrace some of those challenges, how we deal with the growing gap between rich and poor in our world, and how we try to ameliorate some of the real problems that there are for the poorest, because so much of this is about that big gap between rich and poor. And in our own society, the reason why people in the north of England and so on are saying we don't want any more folk in isn't because they're cruel and hard-hearted and they're not sophisticated and civilized. It's because they are worried about the fact that their children can't afford homes, that their children are, that we've depleted all the kind of public housing that there once was, that we haven't replaced it with anything, that their children are not looking at prospects of jobs into the future. They're looking at a pretty bleak picture for them. And so when they feel that there are more people arriving, they see it as being yet another way in which they're likely to suffer the consequences of that, even if they live in places where there's hardly a migrant to be seen. And so it's partly about, again, about not dealing with that great gap between rich and poor, not dealing with the ways in which even in our own society that gap exists, and that we're not dealing with it well enough. And so when people say, we aren't going to be able to, this incredible contradiction, we aren't going to be able to get, hospital appointments and doctor's appointments, and we can't get housing, and we can't get all these things that are ours, that we should be entitled to. Of course, in many ways, they are describing something that is being reduced in the quality and what's available. And yet at the same time, the people who make it all work in the health service or in care homes for the elderly and so on are people who are migrants. And so it's that incredible contradiction that is very visible for us to see, that the people who are actually doing the cleaning and the scouring of floors in restaurants and in toilets and in wherever, the people who are working in our hospitals and in the places looking after the elderly up and down our country are actually migrants. And so we don't have the quality of discussion about what the real issues are here when we come to talk about the business of migration. So today when we talk about refugees, and we go down and have a look at the exhibition, it's reminding us of what it must feel like to be somebody who is deprived of home and place and feeling dispossessed, and to listen to the debates that are currently taking place and to make it feel as though you are loathed and hated. How that must feel. What is it like when you go home and you know that the place that you're going to be spending the night has no feeling of being home? And you'll see that in some of the work downstairs, the sense of fear that can come. And I think that our Chinese artist, I felt in her there was this sense of anxiety and fear that there is for people who come from authoritarian regimes, fleeing the fear, and how it stays with you. And so many of the people that I have worked with tell that story of there only has to be a noise in the night, and they again are hearing bombing, or they're hearing somebody coming for you, or they're hearing somebody doing something terrible to somebody in your family. And to live with that constantly, running like a loop in your head and frightening your nights as well as your days. So we really have to put ourselves into the shoes of others if we're to understand the experience of the refugee, and to remember that most of us, somewhere in our family, somewhere in our background, we've been migrants. Somewhere, one of us, all of us, somewhere, that's part of who we are, and we have to see it in the other every single day. Thank you.
Beautiful talk and incredibly insightful. We want to take the opportunity to invite 3 of the artists from the exhibition up to have a discussion with Helena, and also to open the discussion to the floor. So Anna, Ivica and Yvonne, if you would like to join us. These artists in particular have very important personal histories and stories that have led them to make work that in a way is grappling with their identity of living in the UK, of feeling like an outsider, and asking so many of the questions that Helena's just been speaking about. So please welcome the artists.
Okay. Well, shall I?
Yeah, please.
I just think it's very interesting for people to hear about why your work, what you felt you wanted to try and engage with in your work. Because Anna, your work particularly is looking at that business of feeling displaced.
I've worked quite specifically in the vault room downstairs. It's already a very confined space. The walls, in fact, have steel. I think it's steel and concrete. So it's very hard to penetrate through it. And the door being as it is. So the room already had a sense of claustrophobia, being sort of excluded or confined in a room. And in the past I've worked with objects that refer to intimacy, shelter, safety in childhood. So I decided to collect many child mattresses that were already used and had a life, and I filled the room with these mattresses and compacted them in a way to create a sense of, I suppose, a contradiction between something that's creating like a den, something that should be comforting and sheltering in some way and protective, and at the same time, obviously, there's a sense that where is the individual space in that room? It's extremely claustrophobic and tight. So my interest is in themes that revolve around vulnerability, and that vulnerability that refugees or those who are displaced feel. That vulnerability becomes incredibly heightened, and it's the same kind of vulnerability that a child permanently has. A child is incredibly vulnerable. So I'm interested in how that sense of vulnerability is incredibly heightened in a situation where you've lost your home, you've lost your sort of stability, the family unit, social structure, your home basically. Being expelled from your home and being put into a new situation, everything becomes unstable. You really have to start from scratch. And so, and that sort of space between you, your private life, and the external world is sort of just gone. And so you're literally walking around almost like you don't have skin. So I'm interested in really bringing that to the forefront and I'm interested in bringing to the forefront of children as well, because people tend to react incredibly strongly to images of children being, you know, in the situation of being refugees, all the terrible things that happen to them. We tend to react so strongly, and at the same time there can be an apathy where we tend to forget about children. We tend to forget that this is our future, and so we cover it up with conversations around politics and all sorts of other things. And I'm really interested in really, you know, honing in on the fact that that child is within all of us, and that child is never far away from you know, from who we are, and that this is something that is within all of us, but the privileged perhaps have that, you know, lots of layers between them and the world, and they're protected, and they can live in a space where their identity is formed. They have the space to develop their identity, you know, where they can be creative, they can be educated, and these things give a quality of life. And when these things are gone, you know, you're literally in survival mode continuously, and you can't think beyond the next hour, beyond the next day. So with my work, I wanted to create a sort of scene, an environment where the viewer walks inside a space, to really try and put them inside, I suppose, as you were saying, in the shoes of someone who may be in that situation, to make it immersive, because I think it's difficult for people to access this level of vulnerability. It's too painful to think about it. We'd all rather not really face these things. And that's just the human condition. I think it's, you know.
You've got a different take on childhood, but I'm going to save it for further down.
Okay.
But your paintings, well, first of all, why? Tell us about your paintings.
What do you mean by why?
Well, there's a series of paintings, and for me, there's something that a sense of fear is present certainly in a number of them, and you've had to live with that because of the experiences, particularly of your mother. And maybe do you feel that you can talk about it, or is it all in there in the art?
Well, I can talk about it because the last series of painting that I've made is based on this autobiographical narrative, which is one of my family members became a victim of the kind of the anti-corruption campaign in China, which kind of targets both high level of state officer at the same time as well as lower civil servants. So unfortunately that's the case, and I guess for me, once the events happened, myself as an artist and as an individual, I was thinking, how can I deal with it? And because I lived here and I'm not directly the victim of such thing, and so it completely opens up this kind of space, as you said, this kind of sense of displacement, and at the same time, I want to understand that experience, but at the same time, I'm not in it. So in my painting, I think for me, I'm really interested in this idea of entrapment, imprisonment, loss, memory, and also this kind of boundary between presence and absence. And while I was making the painting, I'm thinking about how I could communicate those kind of my feelings that I felt when I visited the prison, or when I experienced such thing, through creating a shared psychological space. So it's not really directly depicting the events because I haven't seen it in person, like the actual violence or the actual atrocities. But I was thinking whether that can be communicated through the medium of painting. And I guess also for me, my work is not trying to make a political statement because it's something, it's an event that is not yet settled. And I think painting as a medium is great for that because this ambiguity of in terms of generating meaning, in terms of viewing the painting. So the painting is unbinding of statements or meaning. Everybody can project their own memory, project their own subjectivity statement onto the painting, and so it kind of prevent the event itself to fall into a fixed statement, but it's a longer process of searching the meaning of it and its effect, I think. Yeah.
There's a wonderful painting of hands. I mean, like quite often you're doing hands or feet, and there's that where you can almost sense that someone is perhaps picking at the skin around their fingernails or something. That there's that anxious stuff that people do, which is almost self-mutilating when they're afraid or when they're suffering.
I wasn't particularly trying to depict victimhood or trying to sculpt the figure that in a specific event or anything. I guess that's why I focus on hands or body parts without a head, so without identity really. And I think about the muted image and the muteness a lot, because when we think about something that is mute, that means something can or someone can speak, but cannot. So it's muted. So I guess it's through this body gesture somehow trigger the sensation, which tells the story instead of presenting, oh, that's what happened. Yeah.
Yes. I wanted to play when I saw yours.
That's the whole point.
Yeah, tell everyone about your work.
Okay,
That particular work.
That particular, should I start with how deep is your love? Maybe I should start with how deep is your love. Basically,
Yes, how deep is your love? Start with that.
Yeah. I'm dropping every day my kids to school, and like 8 months ago, all these headlines about refugees, and every 15 minutes you will listen headlines about refugees, and after that there will be a song chart, the song How Deep Is Your Love. So there is two parallel worlds facing, in same time. So they are talking about refugees and all crisis, and then just 5 minutes after, whether you've got How Deep Is Your Love song. So my idea is just to combine that sort of question, how deep is really love of Western world. So second piece, kids, I try to go from to be impartial, something that is related to anyone, any country, and we used to play a very simple game with the elastic. So kids used to work very hard to make it complicated for other kids to go through, and that was the whole idea. And in those days you didn't have a PlayStation and that sort of stuff, so you spent a lot of time outside. So any childhood is beautiful childhood, no matter what, in Afghanistan or Pakistan or God knows where, it's beautiful. So the idea was that even kids, they've got passion to make it complicated for other kids how to play a game. But at some point in life, because of war or whatever reason, they have to face reality, that serious problem, serious way how to handle and how to go through everything. So for that reason I put a frame and I put a mirror. So kids, they need to face themselves and go through real game of life. And that was the idea.
It's wonderful.
Yeah, and basically I was trying to sell also elastics, so to bring back that game to kids to school. So my daughter went to school and she explained how to play, and I'm hoping that they will less play PlayStation and
less PlayStation and more of that.
Exactly.
It's sort of like cat's cradle thing.
Exactly.
It's great.
Wonderful. We're going to open questions up to the floor if anyone has any questions for Helena or any of the artists. And it's probably a good time to mention that there are 3 other artists in the exhibition whose work is incredibly relevant and ties in very different ways.
Sam is here.
Sam, where are you, Sam? Sam and Sue, who are over here. So Sam is very interesting because he's not a refugee, he's not someone who is dealing with the kind of issues that we've been talking about, but he's someone who's really gone and lived within someone else's culture in Thailand and really interestingly kind of taken refuge inside a community which is quite fraught and quite difficult. So Sam, do you want to come up here as well?
Sure.
And Sue, when you come and see the exhibition, we invited Sue because her work is almost the moment of cleansing. It's a very tough show. It's asking a lot of very difficult questions, and Sue we invited to give us a moment of respite. And so Sue,
come and sit. There you go. Yes.
Could you tell us a bit about this moment of cleansing inside the exhibition and this moment of relief, Sue?
Yes, I'm showing 2 paintings downstairs, and they are both outside landscape. It's quite bringing a different kind of atmosphere among this really intense exhibition. And I have been working on this idea of repetitions and circulation. I'm using water as a motif. The 2 paintings downstairs, one is about the waterfall and one is about the fountain. And I painted this kind of subject repeatedly, and metaphysically they look similar, but because they are coming from every different moment, so even I painted the image repeatedly, but they are slightly different. So I think my painting doesn't have a really clear policy background in the reality about my nationality or my story, but it's kind of bringing the philosophical notion of the repetition of memories and history and times, that how people experience time in different countries, in different areas, from different cultural backgrounds. Especially painting is something, it's kind of a universalism that everyone in all over the place, all over the world are doing painting because it's so easy. You just need a pen. So I take always this kind of ideas within this image, within this medium. And also I think painting is, I'm fascinated by this medium because it's this static medium. But if you're trying to use this static medium, which doesn't have a time base in it, but you're trying to hold the time, trying to create memory, trying to grab the passing time within this media, it's kind of like an impossible thing. But with the process of trying, it made me start thinking, is that really impossible? So this is like a basic idea.
Sam, do you want to tell us a bit about your experiences of working in Thailand?
Sure, I mean, I was working in Thailand on and off for about 3 years. And in my spare time, I would always take photographs because that's always something I wanted to do. That's my dream. And I discovered a part of Bangkok, the slums, about a year and a half in through my time there. And what I found very shocking, I haven't been to any slums in other parts of the world, what I find very shocking about the Bangkok slums is that Bangkok is very much a first world city. You know, it's very similar to Tokyo or London. But then you have, in the center of Bangkok, you have the slums. And if you walk 15 minutes in any direction, you can find a brand new shopping mall with Gucci handbags. And then you have people living in an area where there are people dying of AIDS, they're suffering from abuse, they're suffering from gang violence, drugs, mafia, and anything negative they are struggling with. So I found that contrast very shocking. And yeah, I started, it didn't start as a project. It started as me just wanting to spend time with these people and just learning about their culture, practicing my Thai with them, playing football, drinking moonshine, whatever, all sorts of things. And then I think it wasn't my aim originally to just photograph this area. It evolved out of my relationship with these people. So I think that, I hope that comes through in the photos. It's not something I set out to do. I think I became emotionally attached to these people. So yeah, I mean, it was a wonderful experience. I would love to go back and to see how things have changed. And I would love for the situation to change there, but I can't really see it changing for the foreseeable future, because the problem with Thailand, they're so invested these days with their public image, because the country itself is going through a complete cultural, religious, political revolution. So sadly, the Thai government doesn't want to get their fingers dirty, per se, in that area of the city. So there is aid there is Christian missionaries who are helping to improve the situation. But yeah, I just hope that, I think my images, they're quite cinematic in a way, and they're quite poetic, but I think what's important is that they have a strong social awareness underneath that, and I think hopefully it can somehow help to change the situation there, because it does make me depressed, and it's something I do care about deeply. So.
But there's also like an amazing piece in your work, and you form relationships with people who most people would think are like very hostile and would never even think to form friendships with.
Of course, yeah, I got very close to a guy. His name was Yap. He's the guy, I think you might have seen him, he's got these amazing full body tattoos. So yeah, I met him just walking through the slums one day. He was living under an overpass in this kind of little shack. And although the language barrier was obviously very difficult, we kind of formed I guess it was kind of a non-verbal relationship in a way. It's quite hard to describe. But yeah, I just learned about his life, and he'd been in jail for 20 years for selling drugs, like the most minute amount of drugs possible. But that's how Thailand is. Whatever you get caught with, it's either life or death. So he told me about his experiences in jail, and he went in there completely, with no tattoos whatsoever, and he came out like a masterpiece.
Yes.
I don't know.
Like the Sistine Chapel.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And yeah, I mean, we hung out, every now and again, every weekend, and it was a very basic relationship, but we had an understanding that was, I hope we did at least, that was beyond words, which is, so I'd like to go back and see how he's doing.
Does anyone have any questions for Helena or any of the answers?
Thanks a lot for your talk, by the way. It was really clear and very timely in your examples of the shocking what's going on. And it's an appeal to all of us to do what little we can do, and what little we can do as a country to try and help these people that do come this far. I think that's very important. But I think it's important as well for us not to be coy about our own greater role in bringing these kind of things about. When our government supports despotic governments that create this kind of situation, or sends our country to war, and what kind of role we play there too, calling our governments on their kind of behaviour. And I wonder whether, in the same vein, that you're calling for what ISIS are doing to be classified as genocide against Zoroastrians, is that right?
No, it's the Yazidi. The people are called Yazidi. I was trying to think of how their religion was sort of very unfamiliar to us, a bit like Zoroastrians would. I was just making a kind of link there. But
would you also, in the same vein, advocate for Tony Blair to be tried for war crimes? Because that's something where we are clearly responsible for somebody who we elected, who lied and brought our country to war and had a very big hand in creating the crisis in the Middle East that we have now. And shouldn't we also be saying, we're not going to let you get away with that? In the same way that you're saying that these people who go and join ISIS are not going to be allowed to get away with it. Because the reality is, we the British people have something that, we have a responsibility to do that. This is our representative that did that, and we need to hold him to account.
let me just say immediately that I was from the off against the Iraq War, and spoke out constantly against it, and ended up in quite a lot of strained relations with my own political party, because I sit in the House of Lords, and so it's never a happy business when you're falling out with the people that you're supposed to be aligned to. I was highly critical of what happened, and I do think that Tony Blair will never recover his reputation from what happened. And I think that we were misled. I suspect that the Chilcot inquiry will be pretty anodyne in a way. There'll be criticisms there, but you'll have to unpick them and so on. And so I think that bringing any kind of case before an international tribunal on war crimes would be very, very difficult. And the other thing is that as a lawyer, I know that business of looking for intent and intention, what was your intention at the time, it would be it is different from people who say, we are going to eliminate a certain people, and to actually make a decision that you're going to write them off the face of the earth, as indeed has been done by regimes at different times. And so, I mean, I think we're talking about something of a different order.
Absolutely,
but
it's still
in
something
relation,
you should let him get away with.
Yeah, but I mean, I do think, I think he's not getting away with it at the moment. I mean, at the moment, I think he's become, in many places, he's a pariah. I mean, he really is. It's a source of, you only have to look at the man to see that he's, haunted by it, whatever kind of life he's leading and the amount of money he's making and so on. I think he's actually living a rather haunted existence. It's not what this man had imagined being the way that he would live out his life. He imagined something very different. And of course, his own narrative of all of this remains that he did it because he believed he was getting rid of a tyrant and so on. And people can be very self-deluding. I actually do think that Tony Blair deluded himself. And I remember Robin Cook, who ended up dying. I don't even remember. Robin Cook was the minister who said, who could not agree and had to leave the cabinet and resign because he was not wanting to go along with it. And I remember discussing it with Robin Cook, and Robin Cook saying to me, I don't understand it. And I said, yes, but I do, because I represent people and have represented people over the years where people, the evidence is there, and yet they'll look you in the face and they'll say, I didn't do it. And they have convinced themselves that they didn't do it. Or that that wasn't within their knowledge at the time. And so I don't think that if you actually put Tony Blair on trial in front of a jury, although we don't have juries for these kinds of cases, but if you did, a jury would be very hard pressed to say this man intended to cause havoc in Mayhem and all of that, and he did it on a false prospectus. Evidentially, what was his purpose and intention? And I think that he was recklessly ill-judged in what he did. And it's unforgivable. But I think in terms of talking about war crimes are committed by people who say, I want no Jew to continue to live. I want no Armenian male to survive. We are raping these women over and over and over again, so that if we impregnate them, it will not be with Yazidi men, because we're going to drive out of existence the Yazidis. And these things happen in war situations, and women are used as a way of doing that. And so, I do think you're talking of something of a very different order. Should Tony Blair be brought to judgment in that way? I think history will not be kind to him because of the judgment he made, because I think we're seeing the consequences of this all the way down the line. I'm told by people in the United States, lawyers, that in fact one of the reasons that George Bush is not travelling, not that he travelled very much before, let me tell you, there was a question of whether he had a passport, but this was not a man of, who was world travelled and who knew the peoples of the world. But he's certainly not travelling now for very fear of having the hand on his shoulder and some Spanish magistrate coming in pursuit of him like they did of Pinochet. So I think there are consequences for people.
Should we scale our representatives into behaving correctly so these kind of situations don't come about?
I think that it's a constant thing where we have to talk about how the vigilance that's necessary, and that we, the people, have to do it. Now, I mean, you've got to remember that, huge numbers of people took to the street in this country to try and say, stop, and don't do this. And so, you know, it's very hard, and it didn't stop it. But we could have this conversation about the award until the end of the campaign, right? But it is true, but we want to go back to your first premise, which is we, yes, have a responsibility, because we, yes, are too unforgiving of tyranny. Yes, we are too silent that we want to do business. I'm representing a young woman just now who is an Egyptian, who has fled. She came to this country, she didn't flee, she came to this country when there was a change in the government, and she came in to study at Oxford. She has, in her absence, along with 500 other people, been put on trial, where her bit of the trial lasted all of about 10 minutes, on evidence that we're still unclear about, and she was found guilty and sentenced to death. Right? This is her, she's in Oxford doing a master's degree at the Lavagna School of Government. Right? She can't now go back. Her parents are there. Her grandmother's likely to die before she'll ever get back. Do you know that we applied for asylum last year? She still hasn't got, a year ago exactly, she still hasn't got an answer as to whether she's got asylum. She's not allowed to work and she's not allowed to volunteer. She's in a fragile economic situation. And let me tell you, the reason why I'm told is because we're doing transactions with the Egyptian government and we don't want to be criticizing them for the way in which they've held trials, sentencing people to death on very poor evidence, and so we make these calculations. They are not what a decent democracy should be doing in its relationships with places in the world that are acting in that kind of way, where human rights are being debased and abused. So yes, and we have to keep saying to our government, this is not acceptable.
Other questions?
Thank you.
Where and how can art mediate this drama, this situation? You can see the end of the day we also here, and you guys are very engaged artists. There's a great show in there. How do you see yourselves? I mean, this is, what is your role, apart from educating and raising the subject, the discussion? How would you place yourselves as well? Because it's hard sometimes to be an artist engaging with such a subject. At least in my opinion, I believe picture, because it is only in a personal level that you can actually relate to this to this extent.
Yeah, if I could talk about that, because I found it extremely hard as well. I've constantly been thinking as an artist how we act, because that's apparently is very different from being a lawyer or being an activist. I guess, well, for me personally, the moment that I was told by this event happened to my family, that moment I felt extremely powerless, because what, as an individual or even as a Chinese citizen, what I can do, there's no way that I could challenge my government, and I don't want to end up going into prison. And is there other way? And that's why I'm trying to find the answer in art. So that somehow like kind of made me look into, for myself, look into existentialist literature, finding a way that is not trying to solve a problem, but present this impossibility of communicating the absurd world could be a way to act, or to kind of, or myself trying to depict this kind of experiences and trying to empathize to people who are experiencing those kind of events or those kind of violence, and communicate it through an art language. And also, for me, I'm thinking about this idea of self-empowerment through art, because I can't imagine myself doing a talk like this about a political event in China, actually. But actually, I could talk about it here. And I think, for me, like, in my painting, I try to create this protagonist so that I could insert my freedom, my right to say this kind of thing. But actually, don't forget that in some kind of authoritarian country, you can't really express even individual thoughts. And I think in art, expressing this kind of individuality, in a way, it's very political already.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was really interesting.
An observation, I think they say in some shops, if you break it, you own it. I feel when it comes to the situation of the refugees, we broke it. You know, whether Blair was right or wrong to have gone in, and I was taken in by the arguments at the time, so I admit that. They created the mess. They had no plan for what we did the day after the invasion. We have broken the Middle East. We have broken it by spending $1 trillion or more on propagating wars, which could have been spent on humanitarian aims. We have broken it by not spending money on bailing out banks that we could have spent around the world. What a shame that we haven't used soft power and influence to improve the lot of the world. Faced with all of these complexities, what outlook do you come up with as artists? Does the creation of art help you feel more positive about the world, more optimistic about the world? Is it negative? Does it have anything to say about your interior thoughts?
Yeah, I was thinking that I struggled for many, many years, even finding my own voice, or even finding the language to start expressing the difficulty that I went through. And so in my later life, I actually began a very long-term psychoanalysis. And over this period of time, I managed to find a voice and a space that was really taken away from me completely. And so moment by, day by day, I started to build a space. And in a way, it's like building a place in the world. And that was my structure. That was the beginning of me being able to form an identity that was sturdy enough to sort of stand in this world and have some strength. And then, of course, this whole time, I had always felt that I wanted to be an artist and that I was an artist. And so psychoanalysis gave me the strength to start, creating work. And I think one of the things that drive me massively are that the sort of solo way, the sort of such loneliness that you have to live with, having these experiences of being ostracized, of being excluded, of losing your voice. It's so painful, and then finding a stage or finding a place where you can express that voice. And I think I give a voice to children a lot, because children do lose their voice, and they're not old enough to be able to give themselves a voice until they're adults. And so that cycle just continues, where children aren't enough at the forefront of what's going on. I mean, even in terms of, in this country, having such a high rate of child poverty that people don't even, I think, realise how high it is. The fact that that doesn't really come to the forefront, because those children who live in poverty grow up in poverty, and they don't really have they're not in a situation to become experts and people who can give themselves a voice later. So they are ignored and excluded. And I think through work, for me personally, all I can do is use my own experience to create work that can create situations like this, where a conversation can develop, and where we can think about these things. And as an artist, you do things in a way that, well, I don't know, my work certainly isn't political. I'm really dealing with the human condition, and dealing with issues that are not easy to talk about. Hopefully through visual means, we can find a way to express these things.
So anyone else have questions?
We're meeting in a former bank here, which is somewhat ironic, because I don't think being an artist is perhaps legendary as being one of the more lucrative careers that someone can go into. And it raises the question as to whether, speaking of government policy, the government here is doing enough to support artists as a voice of refugees, as a voice of the people, generally speaking. And if not, if you had to seek refuge in another country or another city, I'd be curious to know which each of you would choose. Berlin, Paris, if you each had to flee the crippling expenses of living in London, where would you take refuge artistically?
London is the best.
London is the best.
Well, I know it's the best, but okay, well,
There is no argument.
that's okay.
People in London does the best. That's
Okay.
end of the story.
I'm glad to hear that. I'm very glad to hear that. Speaking, I might add, as a born Londoner, as my accent would not suggest, but I'm glad to hear that.
Do the five of you feel that you have more of a freedom of speech and an ability to express yourselves in London?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
London is the best.
That's right.
I guess apart from that, it's to think about, in a way, no matter which country it is, it's a kind of the third space that generated moving kind of in between borders or boundaries. That these issues of minority or immigrants can be talked about, and this narrative that becomes really important is when this kind of national borders intersects and people have this kind of experience moving around countries. So I mean, here is great, but I think because the distance I have had in relation to China make me reflect about myself and my country, and also here. So, yeah.
We have three more questions, so anyone wants to ask something? No? There were some people before China. Does anyone want to ask another question? Yeah.
How much do you think the situation in the Middle East has to do with the legacy of the British Empire as well, previous meddlings? How far do you think it goes back? Do you think it's just a contemporary issue, or do you think it has roots in earlier meddlings?
I think that listen, there are always resonances that affect people's attitudes and thoughts and so on, and one could unpick history and never get over it. Of course, all it haunts our todays, but I do think that we're particularly, I mean, the business of resource is something that's very important for us to think about in terms of some of the decisions that nations make. I think that we're going to see more and more conflict over resource. And there's no doubt in my mind that one of the things that motivated people at the time of the invasion of Iraq was the business of oil. And the bizarre thing is now, of course, is that our sourcing of oil is now with fracking and so on. Apparently, the United States is going to no longer be looking to Saudi Arabia. That will make a change for us. And in fact, I have a particular horror of Saudi Arabia, and I feel that we've been far too soft on Saudi Arabia, which has created this poisonous particular form of Islam that they actually do support by creating mosques all over the place. I remember going to Bangladesh when I chaired the British Council, and I remember a minister in Bangladesh, an education minister, saying to me, please go back and tell your government that one of the great problems here is that you set a bar for us. We go to the World Bank and the IMF and all that. We're told to educate, to prove that we're educating our population. And one of the easiest ways to multiply the education of our children is to let them access more schools. And the only aid that Saudi gives to the world is by building mosques everywhere. And these mosques he warned me, and it was in 2001. And he was warning me that these mosques were being built, and it was ticking the box of how many young children were being educated, primary education, in order to get access to loans and so on. And he was saying, that this is going to poison our system. Bangladesh has a serious problem now with the rise of extremist groupings, and people who are secular or people who are anywhere critical are being assassinated. So, I mean, I really do think Saudi's got a lot to answer for, and we've been too soft on them. And it's interesting that the drop in oil prices, the business of fracking in North America and so on, that's one of the reasons why we're on the verge of some kind of serious conflict between Iran and Iran and Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia is getting worried that Iran is now being kind of courted a bit by the United States in order to prevent nuclear, and so they see a shift in the balance in the Middle East. So, and that's why we're also seeing proxy wars in Syria. Each of those folk have got their own militia, and so has Turkey. And we're seeing this part of the chessboard being used by other nations nations in order to pursue their own particular geopolitical.
It was the case with the original Gulf War, wasn't it? The original invasion was funded by.
So I think that yes, does our ancient history and so on affect all of this? Well, it creates levels of distrust, of course. But it's not that long ago when Iraq or Syria and so on, had communities, Christians and Jews were driven out of places like Damascus and driven out of places like Baghdad. Prior to, it's not that long ago when people lived and worked alongside each other. And so, the horror of all of that has been exacerbated by contemporary wars. But I wanted to say something before we sort of stop discussing this, was that one of the things that always shocks me is that we've got a duty laid in law by the Refugee Convention, which we're all signed up to, which is that we're supposed to give asylum to people who can show they're fleeing persecution. And because we have a duty to do it, unlike migrants and so on, we can decide what we like as nations, or within the European Union about migration. But on asylum seekers, we're supposed to have a duty. The way that we deal with that is by disbelieving. And so we deal with it by basically having a culture of disbelief in the Home Office. So when the people arrive and they end up having to be processed, from the very go-get, people are not believing them. So they say, I want asylum, I'm fleeing from whatever. And they are treated with suspicion. Their story is not going to be true. And so I represent women, and they would take a time before they'll even talk about the fact that they've been multiply raped, because to even talk about such a thing in their culture is so frightening. But even to talk about they're being stopped by immigration officers who are wearing uniforms or whatever, or people in authority are the very people who've persecuted them, so they're frightened of any people in authority. They don't know whether they're to trust them or not. And so you get a sort of awful business that goes on, where our processes for dealing with this are often in themselves very un-embracing and not accommodating the fear and terror people have, and how they take time before they feel able to give their story.
So then, in fairness, wouldn't it be naive to assume that there aren't people out there who want to...
There are people, of course, who will come around. No, and let me assure you, I am not a day-in-the-country woman who thinks that everybody is... I'm not Pollyanna, I'm thinking everybody who arrives is absolutely telling the truth. But the problem about it is that once you set up that thing of starting point, which is that they're all lying, is that you're likely to do injustice to people who are not lying. And so, it's about finding the right kind of expertise to be sure that that when you're talking with people, that you allow them the opportunity of giving their account. And of course, there will be people who will be schooled in a story, and there will be difficulty in penetrating whether it's true or not. But I think that we're often too harsh in the decision making that we do make.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you for your talk and everyone else's. I'm an Arab, I'm not a refugee, but I'm the daughter of refugees. And I'm trying to find a way to put this into words, but it seems to me, I came to the UK 5.5 years ago, and very recently I began to see that somewhere in the system here, it is built in such a way that I often give the Oscars as a silly example. For example, white Americans invented the Oscars, and then they proceeded for the next 70-odd years to give them to themselves and say, oh my God, look, we're the best. And I find that somewhere in the foreign politics and international law systems, it's almost like a 21st century version of cultural colonialism, where these first world, and I have a really big problem with those labels, first and third world, countries are able to say, we know what human rights is, and we have to implement that everywhere. And obviously there are some, we are the first victims of ISIL and Daesh, and we know. And obviously there are some things that are clearly inhumane. But often there's this sweeping colonialist presumption that everyone has to live the way we do because we are democratic. And from what I am seeing, it's quite hypocritical, and it's not. And from what you are telling us as well. And so, how do you, as a lawyer, obviously you are working inside that system. You can't just say, "Oh, fuck the system." That's like anarchy. So, excuse my language. So how do you negotiate that, working inside a system that is almost inherently culturally, they will never fit. They will never fit. It's like when Sykes and Picot rocked up and said, right, this country is this border and this country is that border, and we've been having wars ever since, and we really, truly have been so messed up.
Can I just say it's the same thing in Yugoslavia as well? The borders there, the war is lurking again, because somebody said we put the borders.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The drawing of lines on maps. I mean, it goes back to the question that you were asking about. That, you know, do we have a responsibility that goes further back? Undoubtedly, one of the ways in which we in those periods of colonisation, of drawing lines on maps. We did it in Africa, we did it in the Middle East, we did it all over the place. Creating, because the idea was the pursuit of nationhood. Nations were the way in which to organise peoples, and we only did that by putting up lines around what would be a nation. And of course, it often crossed through tribal lands, through places that people considered to be their homeland, and even if they didn't have ideas of nationhood. So, and in many ways, nationhood is a very, comparatively speaking, contemporary concept. So, and it's one of the ones I'm still always slightly suspicious of, this idea of nation, of being overwrapped in the idea of my nation, my pride, But I've always, in a way, found myself more comfortable having a foot in and a foot out of everything that I do. So that I've been a lawyer, but a lawyer who has a critical eye on how the legal system works. I've been a member of parliament, but with a lot of foot out, so that I kind of am not. Some people can't choose that, and I've learned about myself that I choose that thing of never quite going in. I never go native, even with the establishment. I always kind of need my sanity to be retained by having one foot out. Now, so how do I feel about that? I mean, and do I think that human rights are really universal? I just needed some radio programs on this very subject. You see, I think that if you go back to what human rights is supposed to be about, I actually do think that most people know what pain means. I think people do know what it would mean to be tortured and humiliated and degraded and not treated as fully human. I know what it means. I think that we know those things. I always remember my mother's abiding lesson to me was, always remember nobody's better than you, but never think you're better than anybody else. Mm-hmm. And it's the two sides of that same coin, and it's the lesson we should be giving our children. And I think that human rights are really not complicated. They're about that simple thing, about treating people as human beings worthy of respect and not dehumanizing them. And I think that, when folks sat around the table, Eleanor Roosevelt had this thing of getting people together, and she got lawyers and jurists and folk from all around the world. Most cultures and religions were present at the table. Nobody had clean hands. Nobody was not hypocritical. The Russians were throwing folk into Soviet camps. We had a horrible colonial history. The Americans still had Jim Crow laws, which meant that black people sat at the back of the bus and were not allowed into the same dining cafes as white people. So nobody, was looking too good, and nobody treated women well. Nobody. So so let's be clear. And what has happened with human rights is, of course, we've expanded the remit. I mean, what everybody wants and yearns for is to love and be loved. You don't have to go far in the world to know that. Your people in the poor parts of Thailand and so on. Everybody has those yearnings to yearning for meaning. What are we here for? And sometimes that leads people down roads of religion, but for other people it will be about something else. It will be art or whatever. But we those things are common to all human beings. And I think they sought a rather useful formulation of what it is that people need to be truly human. And so for me, I don't think it's that business of is it culturally relative and so on. You know, when you know a nation says, you know, don't tell us what to do, it usually means that they're doing bloody bad things to folk. You know, don't be doubtful about it. When you know people say, "Are women like being repressed?" Just you know, are we hearing it from the women? Or have the women been receiving that message as that's how they should function as women, saying, this is how I like it, you know, FGM and all that, you know. So we've got to peel back. Who is it that's telling us that they don't like human rights? And it's usually the people that are benefiting from doing bad things to other people. So, you know, I actually don't believe in that argument that you know, it's all culturally relative and so forth. Of course, you know, people have to make those journeys themselves, and I'm never comfortable with the idea that you know to tell people how to do stuff. But I'm not going to stand by and keep my mouth closed while women are doing things to women's vaginas and removing their clitorises. I'm sorry, you know, some things you know you can't remain silent about. I'm not going to remain silent about torture. I'm not going to remain silent about the things that are being done in the name of religion to women. So I think that, you know, I want to hear who's saying it, because almost always it's, you know, you're hearing it from the elders of religions, or who are mainly men, or you're hearing it from governments that don't bear close examination. So I actually think look to what's under there and what human rights are really about, and it's really simple, and it's about being truly human.
Thank you so much. I think that's amazing. Have the tour downstairs if anyone would like to join. I'm sure you'd all like to see the exhibition if you haven't had the chance yet. I just want to thank all of the artists here, Sam, Ivica, Sue, Yvonne and Anna, and of course Helena for her amazing talk. And I'd also like to quickly mention the 6th artist in the exhibition who couldn't join us tonight. Svetlana Dmytrenko is Ukrainian and she cannot leave the Ukraine because of the current political situation there. She's an absolutely amazing young artist who is only 23 years old. She's been going on her own to the front line of the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, documenting everything with borrowed cameras and editing it on friends' computers that are hours away from where she lives, just so she can tell the story that isn't being told. So some of Svetlana's films are being shown downstairs, and we're also going to be organising a screening of them so we can watch them in full. But it's just so important to mention her as a 6th artist, because she's someone who really, not even in a particularly conscious way, has turned art as the only way of expressing and telling her story, and trying in some way to get the truth out about what's going on in these places in the Ukraine that are getting no exposure at all. And we'll be sharing on our website Svetlana's videos as well, so you can watch them in your own time. So thank you again to everyone. Please have a drink, talk to each other, whatever, and in about 5 minutes' time I'll be giving a tour of the show.